Record to the cloud. I'm recording to the cloud.
Oh, that's new.
Okay, so in this paper, oh, sorry, I'm getting funny message up. I was just going to read something from the conclusion because I thought it was a nice sort of summary. So he or she, they, I don't know whether it's a he or she.
He.
He.
She.
She.
Female.
She.
Female.
Right, thank you. Right. She says, this article has set out to explore the study of relating without being restricted to the terms of politeness and impoliteness, both as theoretical concepts and as first-order discursive concepts. The recent focus on politeness as judgment by interactants brings the notion of contextual norm into research attention. So to me, essentially, this is about the role of norms in politeness research. Contextual norms of appropriateness are at the basis of such relational work judgments as politeness and impoliteness, and norm variability underlies relational work dispute. And then, so she wants to apply Habermas, which I think is interesting. Addressing the relational aspect of communication, Habermas's concept of normative rightness claim highlights the normative commitment of the speaker in the act of utterance, which has been obscured by the focus on the hearer's judgments in relational work research. The speaker's communicative act carries the presupposition that what he or she says is right or appropriate with respect to a normative background of institutions, conventions, rules, etc. Differentiating the acts of raising normative rightness claim and responding to it helps us to analyze the way in which participants in interaction negotiate relationships by negotiating norms. And then a little bit further, this dynamic process of relating can be further explicated by drawing on Culpepper's 2008 and Kadar and Ahor's 2013 differentiation of norms. Okay, so the questions that I have for you guys, do we find the notion of normative rightness from Habermas, normative rightness claims useful? And do we find the application and analysis of the different types of norms, the way that she has done to these data, convincing and helpful? So, but you can say whatever you want, you don't have to answer those questions.
Okay, answer to question 1, yes.
Why?
Could say more. I found the idea of rightness claims like that, it was very instructive. I found, that it makes you realize, I mean, in a way, it's another way of saying what we already know, that when you say something, when you perform any kind of linguistic act, you are making all kinds of claims and assumptions and so on, but I suppose this is one way of articulating that and one way of exploring it. And I like what she did in that, the first subsection of that bit where she introduces it, with that, yeah. please bring me a glass of water and so on,
That's from Habermas, isn't it?
It is from Habermas, yeah. And I thought, yeah, I think this could be useful. I don't personally see how it actually shall we say, counteracts a perceived imbalance about evaluation. That the evaluation is, in the discursive approach, is about the hearer, and this is a way of getting it back to the speaker. I don't really see that, because even in that Habermas example, you've got to have the hearer interpreting these claims and which are made by the speaker. But I think it was a very instructive way of understanding possible interpretations and therefore possible evaluations by participants, shall we say, rather than hearers in particular.
I mean, I think I agree. I found it very interesting. Does anybody know of other work where Habermas has been applied to politeness studies?
I mean, I must admit, I'm not at all familiar with Habermas, so this is quite,
interesting.
I mean, my question, we have thought about the speakers, what the speaker's doing, but that's usually been framed in terms of intent. I think what might have been interesting, it occurs to me now, is if she'd compared, because the problem with an intent is, of course, you can't know what people intend. So we have that, that issue. You can't look inside somebody's head. So actually, perhaps a nice argument to have made here would be that treating it as a rightness claim gets away from that idea of intent and avoids that need to look inside somebody's head.
Well, it brings in, I mean, because she talks about negotiating the relationships, and it brings it into that arena, doesn't it? Rather than, so as Jim says, it's perhaps not so much about hearer and speaker as about what's going out, what goes on when you put the language out there, and how is that debated, disputed, negotiated between people, whether they're speakers or hearers.
But you're probably still going to have issues about what addressees take the rightness claims to be.
Yeah. But then surely the evidence for that is in how they respond.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But you can't get away from that issue that, well, I mean, I suppose, that speakers sometimes get it wrong.
Yeah.
In terms of how they frame something, and probably reasonably often we get it wrong, and but also that just those those disagreements about what is allowable or not, and whether it was meant to cause offence, for example, which is one of the things we're always concerned with when we're looking at politeness, im/politeness, is whether if offence was taken, was it intent, was that the outcome that the speaker was expecting and aiming for.
Yeah.
I think that the problem I have is that I'm looking at it from the point of view of foreign language politeness. It assumes that both people have the same concept of what's going on, the same norms, etc. And when I see this word negotiating, I often feel that someone working in their second language, can they really negotiate with someone who's in the target language, their first language? And then we can even go within the same country. Do people share the same norms and the same ideas of what's going on? At the risk of sort of stereotyping, people from the north of England, the south of England, or different social classes, etc. To me, it sounds. I mean, I understand what the argument is. I just don't know what happens in practice, and especially, I mean, she mentions it in the art of context is incredibly important, really, in interpreting what's going on.
I mean, I think she is trying to take account of those. Well, she, by inciting other authors, taking account of those the variation in norms, that the assumptions that people have as to what the norms are, and in a way, isn't that one of the points of the paper is to try and show that within an interaction there may be different, even individual norms, and that they may be different, but they have to be, well, they don't have to be, but they kind of come out in the interaction, and that they're, I mean, perhaps negotiation isn't the right word, but they're sort of managed, or they're debated, or they're disputed in the interaction. And yeah, so you're right, you can't always, you can't, well, I think people do tend to assume that the people that they're talking to have the same norms as them, often, but often they're wrong as well. But that can come out in the interaction sometimes not.
Yeah, because you don't, people don't, you know, I get quite irritated by being called things like love in shops and by, you know, people half my age, and it's just like, no, really. But most of the time I don't say anything.
Yeah.
Because I'll probably just seen as a grumpy old woman. But you know, that's kind of, it's making a particular claim to a relationship, which I don't think is reasonable.
Yeah. But they may be making it based on a different norm.
Yeah, exactly. I know, exactly. I'm sure it's not meant in any kind of offensive way. It's just, I think it's an inappropriate way to behave in those interactions, but that's my norm, which is different to theirs. And I suppose it's you know, my desire to react is to kind of just say, actually, not as everybody shares the same norms as you, you know, not everybody agrees that that's the right thing to do.
And you're in the position to do something about it, if you want to react or not. But if you have the dimension of power, so someone who's powerless, there's not much they can do about an imposed norm, can they?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's certainly true. I mean, I think there's a kind of shop interactions I'm thinking about. Often, you know, staff are instructed by their companies about how to engage with staff, and they're encouraged to kind of use this very sort of positive politeness kind of interaction stuff, which annoys me intensely. So in some senses, they're in a bit of a double bind as well. But yeah, no, I mean, you know, perhaps in circumstances like sort of teacher pupil, for example, where there's a very clear power relationship, yeah, absolutely. Person who is on the receiving end of that power can't really do anything about it, which is, you know, very frustrating. Yeah, I was in a seminar this morning, and it was about online teaching, and the person running it, a prof in education, and was talking about the need to engage students, you know, to really engage students, particularly in online context, and was telling a story about his daughter who had been been in class and found the delivery of the teacher really boring, and it had kind of zoned out. And then the teacher asked her a question, she didn't know, so she said, "No, I'm sorry, I don't know." And the teacher responded, "Oh, you don't know." And of course, you know, she's just got to sit there and grit her teeth, otherwise she's going to be in trouble.
I didn't think that sort of thing still went on.
I know. I mean, it's just.
Is it even possible to speak like that?
I mean, it's to a school child. I don't think I mean, the idea of doing that in a university is just, well, actually, probably my brother does. But.
That's a very localized norm.
Yes, my brother is a very localized norm, I think.
He's got his own norms.
Yeah. But yeah, but it's a classic example of that. She was in a position that she was unable to, you know, to give her own evaluation of how she felt about that.
As long as you don't do that to us now and ask us a question.
Yeah, I was quite amused by the way that Karen sort of set this up, because like the kind of, you know, actually, to Karen to have perfected that, you needed to give us a minute to think about it.
Oh, right. Is that the technique? Right.
Yeah. That's interesting, that, because really that makes it even worse, doesn't it? giving a minute to think about it, don't you think?
It just feels like dead air to me. I'm not very good at that.
But it's not just that.
No, I tend to tell people to discuss it between themselves first. That's why.
Yeah, but you can't do that in an online context, really.
Exactly, which is why I hate doing seminars online. But anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. But seminars with people sat a metre apart, it's going to be a lot better on that either.
I think it's a very simple example, but what you were talking about, Beth, about that the shop assistant or whoever sort of addressing you by a certain vocative, that you find presumptive, and you don't know what you don't know for a start is whether it is that individual's, shall we say, habitual manner of address to just about anybody, or whether it's something to do with the way they've been instructed. I mean, you can't be sure.
Or is it to do with a stereotype or a certain perception they have of you?
Yeah, definitely. It could be that as well. But I think what is interesting about it is it would be evaluated as downright impolite, I think, for you to make a fuss about it. To call them out.
I'll just be saying,
now that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. So even though there isn't really a power relationship there, supposedly, or if anything, I think, as Jerry was kind of put, at one level, the customer is always right. That idea of the customer having power to some extent. Actually, it's not really how it works.
Well, I suppose instrumentally, it works in the sense that, if you call them out and say, don't talk to me like that, they're not going to say, right, get out of this shop and don't come back, No. But emotionally, you would be in the doghouse.
I think it would be awkward, but I wouldn't necessarily say it would be evaluated as impolite, depending on how you said it. Because I think people evaluate a lot on the manner in which you say things as well as what you say. So if you were to say, I prefer it if you called me Dr. Davies, or something like that.
Or I prefer it if you didn't use a vocative. You don't need to. And actually, this is a very complex area. And don't use a term like love. You didn't need it.
Or whatever you could say. But if you said it in that way, like please don't call me love. I think they'd feel very awkward. I think it would make it awkward. But I don't know that they'd go away and say, "Oh, that customer I had today was really rude."
Well, they probably, I mean, as I said, I think you get categorized as, grumpy old woman kind of thing.
Yeah, which is not necessarily the same as being impolite.
No, true. Yeah, but
I don't know how much.
But but it wouldn't be an easy conversational move. It wouldn't be.
No, because it interrupts the conversational flow apart from anything else.
Yeah,
doesn't it?
But sorry, Jim.
No, go ahead, Barbara.
No, I was wondering what is, because the article and of course we here are talking about frames of expectations, right? So, in the context of the corner shop, is love more of a normative vocative than Dr. Davis is? I mean, I don't know that anybody calls me doctor outside of.
Well, I mean, no, I obviously wouldn't expect that at all. And
by responding, by objecting to be called love, you're actually sort of in an awkward putting yourself in an awkward position because you're objecting, you're questioning what is effectively a normalized kind of formulation and maybe demanding one which isn't normalized. And I'm not using good or bad for deliberately here, but
I mean, I think it probably I think it was in a context where I wouldn't have expected it. Like if I go to Leeds Market, then I expect to get called love because everybody gets called love in Leeds Market.
Yes, true.
I have attested exampld from a 60-plus-year-old male colleague. And my students also being called. So but I think this was like something like in Tesco's or something where I wasn't expecting it.
It's all contextual, isn't it?
Yeah, where it wasn't the norm, and it just struck me as odd. odd and inappropriate and unwanted. So yeah, but it isn't easy to kind of challenge to challenge those things.
No,
I mean, it's doable, but it's not easy. And I was on that particular occasion, I just sort of really, no, not going there.
But isn't the problem that you're denying the nature of the relationship? That she's trying to say that we have a certain relationship, maybe just at a phatic level, and you're just denying that. So maybe it's not rude or impolite as such, but it's a rejection of the other person, isn't it? I mean,
in terms of this, it would be denying the rightness claim, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and I think
it's not the right relationship to claim.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the idea of the rightness claim worked much better with the examples that involved those kind of naming strategies.
I was going to say, I think that was quite interesting that a lot of the examples were on forms of address.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just telling as to how much we do load into an address form in terms of norms and relationships.
Yeah, which is why actually in many cases I think they're better avoided, if because there is this very complex field you're trying to negotiate. Unless it's really clear what kind of address term you should be using, if there's an option just not to use one, then that's probably safer, frankly.
That's a very British attitude.
Well, I was going to say, I think, Ping, do you have something to say about, I mean, is that how it works in whatever your native language is? I don't know. But I'm guessing in China it might be different. Is it more set how you address somebody? Is it more?
Yeah, I totally agree. The address forms definitely are loaded with the assumptions or preference or expectations of the relationship. But China, maybe it's different, like in the workplace, in the real Chinese workplaces, people will use terms of address that indicate the ranks. For example, that will be considered as polite. And I was thinking of an incident where I offended a former colleague after many years after I came back to my university after my study in the UK. And so she used to be one of my bosses, and she asked me, so how's everything going with you? So I told her how it is. And then I just asked back. I said, so how about you? And then she was so offended and she ignored me and turned back the left. So it took me some time to think what we are expected to say, even just a greeting like that, not only address forms.
So was that because there was a difference in status between you?
I think so. That's my guess.
Well,
yes.
Did she assume higher status?
Definitely, because she used to be like at the school level. She used to be, I think she was the party secretary before I left the university. So I met her in the hospital of the university. And so I thought it's a norm because I've been in the UK for some years. So I thought it's a norm to greet back and ask how she is. But later I thought maybe I'm not supposed to. So she's entitled to check how I am. Maybe I'm not entitled to checking how she is. So a lot of these kind of offenses or norms of interactions may be more confined or influenced by the hierarchical expectations in the society here.
Yeah, I mean, her reaction suggests that is at least you're talking about the normalized level, if not the actual, because it was a very extreme reaction, wasn't it? Yes. Unequivocal reaction.
Yeah, she wasn't keeping it to herself. She wasn't
presumably, if she merely felt somewhat felt personally affronted by it, but you know, she wouldn't have felt entitled to just sort of cut you out like that. So that there must be some sort of discourse, you know, that she's, you know, it must be articulated in some way, mustn't it? That the lower status person has no right to inquire after the well-being of the higher status person. I suppose, is it because it's well, it's what I would call too much positive face work. You know, I mean, you know, it's too close, too intimate.
I think that applies in a much more subtle way to should we say, I can't say without generalizing, but you know, to British interactions. I think it's much more subtle, but I think if you were to notice who asks who in when there's a power difference, who asks who what.
Well, I think the thing here, I feel, I don't know what others feel, that I would not ask an obviously higher status person who wanted to be high status. I wouldn't ask after their well-being unless they had already asked me.
Yeah.
You know, that the higher status person would have to make the first move. And then I think probably it might, depending on the, you know, the precise nature of the hierarchy, it would probably be only politic to ask back. You know, it'd be sort of, it's what you do, sort of thing. How are you? How are you? You know.
But that maybe you there's perhaps more you feel more an onus to you to actually answer the question as though it wasn't just a greeting, if you know what I mean, to be more fulsome, perhaps, whereas you wouldn't expect that from them.
Yeah. Yes.
I think what also complicates this incident is the no answer or the silence and turning away. So it leaves the person thinking, what did I do wrong?
What did I do?
If you actually said to someone, don't, that's not the custom, or I don't like it, but makes it even more, maybe it's the wrong word, effective, what that person's trying to achieve, because there's no silence, walk away. So you're left thinking, what did I do wrong?
Actually, I think that's an interesting case of example of a case where the hearer's uptake doesn't give us any more access to their intentions, because I mean we can notice the uptake, right? The person has been displeased in some form, but we still.
But you don't know exactly why.
Interpret it, explain it in some.
So you know it's been evaluated as impolite, but you don't know why.
Well, we don't even know that, do we? I mean,
well, I suppose so.
At that point they had a toothache or whatever. We just don't know.
You just know that the interaction didn't go as you might have expected.
There was a hiccup.
And
in terms of our analysis as observers, we would have to make note of that, but we still wouldn't be able to give it any meaning unless we ask that person somehow. So the advantage of the uptake takes us only up to a point, I think. Of the hearer's uptake compared to only exploring speaker's intentions, only takes us up to a point.
Yeah, my conclusion was I offended her because I tried to claim equal relationship, equal status.
And so that you, in your experience, your frame of reference gives you that much material to make that kind of computation, but the person might have come from a completely different frame and something else might have happened that you'll never know.
Yeah, that's possible. Yeah, unless I interview her. But in that social occasion, I couldn't.
The awkward.
Probably any occasion.
And you haven't had any subsequent contact with them?
Never.
So
I do feel though that, as I said, you know, maybe you can correct me, but you know, the way you describe it, Pindu, it seems to me that it is a very extreme reaction, you know, and that given it was an extreme reaction, it's being telegraphed, you know, it's being semaphored, you know, that this is wrong of you. What an attack on me, or you know, that because of the nature of that reaction, we can appeal to more, you know, it isn't more than she just had a toothache, that day or something, or had to run to another appointment. You know, I
Yeah.
think
Yeah. Mm.
Because if you had a toothache, you'd probably apologize afterwards, wouldn't you, or something? You know, you'd probably say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I had to run off."
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's the limitation of the interpretation, isn't it? When I was trying to interpret it and explain it to myself, I used the theories I'm familiar with. But the thing is, there are many, many levels of context that I wasn't probably aware of.
But I also think the problem is that I don't think we can solve that problem even by asking the person what they intended, because firstly, they may not be honest about what they were doing, and secondly, they may not even be aware themselves completely. So it's
yes. Which actually leads me to the other question. As I said, I'm sorry, I only read the first few pages and I haven't really, I haven't got enough to appreciate the nuances, but and I haven't read Habermas either. So in my very limited read.
That is not just me.
No,
but now I really want to, because this is
me
relevant.
too, yeah.
So it was a good reading you chose. Thank you for that. But as I was reading the abstract and the first few pages, I mean the notion of so presupposition of right, normative right, is that the phrase? Kind of suggested to me initially, and in a completely unconscious way, that this would be a kind of presumption rather than a presupposition, and in a way that made me question the concept, because I thought, you know, people don't normally necessarily presuppose or presume that they are doing the right thing. But I think in terms of if we understand this as you can only do what you think it's the right thing to do based on your personal history, your context, your education, your knowledge, your understanding of other people's the dynamics with other people. So it's not even a choice in a way. You just tend towards the equilibrium, as in Locke and Watts' definition. The politic behavior is a kind of the neutral form, right? The form that doesn't mean plus or minus. So in that sense, it is necessarily so that you only do what you, I mean, unless you're deliberately trying to disrupt some equilibrium, in which case that is also the right thing to do according to the norms of disruptions. You can only do what you think works on the basis of your experience. So what is more interesting for me is to establish how do you know, what makes you think that something is the default option? What history you bring to it? And you know, what is your trajectory to come to have that particular ideology that says this is okay to do, or demand, or say, or state, or call someone, or whatever. But I don't know if I understood that term correctly, actually. So I'm gonna have to reread and read Habermas.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Is how do you know that that's what they're doing? There is kind of assumption there, but yeah, maybe we'd have to read Habermas to find out more about it. But as to what kind of norms you're orienting to, isn't that? I mean, she discusses different people's theorization of norms, doesn't she? And the different kinds, and some norms are a lot are there's experiential, so based on your previous experiences and what you've learned. And I think, doesn't Turku kind of, when she talks about frames, she kind of talks about that as well, and that you can actually, you know, you could count the number. I know it's a kind of quantitative approach, isn't it? I'm a bit vague on the details, but you know,
yes,
if you encounter a behavior enough times, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think experience is a function of you know, the amount of occurrences of something that you have noticed and learned to be the, you know, what people do. So there is a computation somewhere of a quantitative computation of the likelihood of something being what people do, and the responses that people normally get if they say so, and so on and so forth. So that quantitative computation must be there in somewhere in the way we achieve things. But then there's also, of course, a lot of ideology or subjective positioning rather involved as well. So your particular valorization or of this or that. In fact, you know, as Jim was giving that example of, as a British person, probably not going to ask a superior how they are, struck me as something that, you know, as someone who's lived in the UK for 25 years, I should know, and I was surprised to hear nevertheless. So I'm thinking, you know, why didn't I notice that that's what people do until now? Maybe it's because
Wait, don't take me as gospel, for God's sake.
But I mean, it's a good example.
This is just my, I mean, and that raises an interesting question. Did I, you know, is that my assessment of how things are based on my aggregate of experience, or is it something much more personal about my own way of doing things?
We don't always know, do we? And we quite often assume that what is norm, that something we think is normal for everybody, and it takes you coming up against it to realize.
Which is really why I was thinking that, you know, after all, what you presuppose or presume to be the norm is just a function of your knowledge. You can only know so much that you have, you know, experienced or heard about or whatever. So it's not what's out there, because out there's nothing objective that exists independently from you noticing it or knowing about it. And you've got to, and all you can mobilize is your knowledge and experience of something previous experience.
I mean, of course, one's own experience does include one's interpretation of top-down imposed norms. You know? Even at a society level. Think of norms of behavior in the last 18 months. You know. That you know, I suppose that's, you can say, yes, you can say that is in the end just personal experience for each individual, but it's definitely it's that top layer of norms, if you like, sort of the
it's like with
shall we say, institutionally imposed and breaking of which sometimes attracts action, you know, and they are there quite definitely.
I think it relates heavily to Bourdieu, the idea of us constructing, you know, maybe in our case more linguistic capital, but social capital. What are the norms that we experience and how we build on them? And like what Jim said, I obviously I realize what he's saying, and I agree with it, but I never even thought about it before, that I'd never ask a superior. So it's like something that's ingrained in you,
it's not conscious.
Although I would say
I never thought of it before. Believe me.
As this is being taped, I think we can take Jim as gospel, can't we?
So I have achieved a normalization.
Probably we are going to notice how
it's always contestable
from now on.
Well, I might have recited this example before at some point, but I didn't know that I had this kind of norm and expectation until it happened. Was when a student came to see me in my office hour. He walked into the office, made some greetings, and then switched the light on. And it really got my hackles up. I was like, how dare, but I would never have thought a student is not entitled to switch the light on in my office until it happened, you know.
It happened to me too. It's interesting you say that. I felt really insulted.
I did.
But
isn't
that's
that more
interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, you say a student because that's what happened. But I don't think this is a power thing as such. I mean, is anybody entitled to come into a room, a guest, you know, even a guest of higher rank?
Isn't it more to do with your
Vice Chancellor if the vice
Maybe,
chancellor came
yeah.
into your office and switched on the light,
It's a question of territory, not rank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's your space, and someone's invading your space, even though your space is 6 by 6 or whatever.
Get out my broom cupboard, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It may be small, but it's my broom cupboard.
Yeah.
Mm. Now, I found the notion of levels or layers of norm very, thought-provoking as well. I mean, both the way she describes Kadar and Hor as describing it as layers of moral order, and also the Culpeper one as well, which are more or less the same thing, I think.
So what was it about the differentiation, Jim?
You have, what is it, localized norms, community of practice norms, and then sort of wider social norms, something like that.
Yeah. So you're really looking just at a different grain size, aren't you? So no reference for community of practice, I noted, though.
I think that was in the second level, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah, community of practice is in there.
No, what I mean is there wasn't cited or
oh right, it wasn't. Well, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Just used, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And I
also,
think
she mentions Arga, because Arga talks.
Arga does my head in. I just don't get it.
But she doesn't. She doesn't. In the summary, she says she's using Kadar and Hor and Culpeper, but she doesn't say Arga, even though that is discussed earlier.
Yeah, I mean, if I had one,
it's the same thing again, isn't it?
I think
there seemed to be like a bit of a proliferation of literature usage and not very clear about how different things contributed at points. It was like, certain things were explained and then not really taken up again. Suddenly we're talking about he went into using Hella Spencer-Otis model and using technology for that. Which I found is just like, I mean, I probably should be the last person to criticize for cherry picking a bit from different models, but I do try and justify why I'm bringing, why I'm making that shift. So I found that a little bit disorienting at times.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, by and large, I found that the descriptions and summaries and interpretations of the research are very informative and lucid.
It was nice to see that kind of put together in that way.
Yes, it really was. But yes, I see what you're getting at. Yeah, that sometimes it seemed a little bit scattergun.
Yeah. I just have a real problem with Agra. I just can't. I don't know. It just doesn't go into my head for some reason.
It is difficult.
Yeah, I know. It's magic, that, isn't it? How some writers speak to you and others don't.
Yeah, he does speak to me. I find it clear, actually. I mean, information overflow I experience on every single page, but when I take time to read this, for me, it's one of the clearest formulations ever. Have you tried comparing that with Silverstein? That you
yeah.
He's a scholar of him, right? And colleague. I mean,
I have tried to read some Silverstein, and it's just
impenetrable.
Well, I wouldn't go necessarily quite that, but it's very, very hard work.
I'm looking at Aga's, social norms thing. It's pages 138, 139 in this thing now. And again, I realize it is essentially the same thing. In fact, I think, some of the terminology I used was from him, but it could have been Kadar and Hor, it could have been Culpeper. You've got these three levels. You've got the norm that is essentially unconscious, and unless something happens which brings it to your attention, and then you've got the normalized, what he calls reflexive model. In other words, recognized by at least some people. And then you've got you might call prescription, the normative standard, linked to judgments of appropriateness and so on. It's the same thing again. I suppose, yes. Okay, the interesting thing is the way Aga describes it it seems to be levels of consciousness, of explicitness, and the way, say, Kaja and Hoare describe it, it's scales, it's social scales, as it were, you know, or a matter of scale. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So yeah, with Kaja and Hoare, it's kind of like an inverted triangle, isn't it? It's sort of like, you know, the very, very particular things that of your experience as compared to what your immediate group does, as compared to, and you may well be involved in multiple groups, of course, multiple communities of practice that have different sort of you know, sets of expectations associated with them, and then you have generic societal norms, and I'm sure there's lots of gradations in between those things as well, but it kind of gives a broad idea of the kinds of variations that we use on a day-to-day basis, whereas AGA is more about, it's more conceptualizing it. So I mean, like the externally observable, well, that's almost like just an empirical description of, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a kind of almost like a scientific sort of, you know, this is what happens.
Yeah. So I think he talk about, because I wrote about this a while ago, something that I haven't published yet, but I think he talks about it as a statistical norm. So objectively, you can again, you get that idea of measurement, that it's normal because it appears so many times. That behavior appears, you know, in almost like in a bell curve kind of way. I'm guessing.
Here's a comment from Sam in the chat.
Yeah.
Who doesn't have the chat up.
Ideology, yeah.
Well, I mean, ideology often is kind of social structure, isn't it? So,
yeah, of course it has to do with everything is ideological.
Yeah.
Right? So there's nothing that sits outside of.
I mean, I think you could argue that the ideological stuff comes into all of those levels, because it, you know, certainly comes into societal level. But I mean, arguably, even like, you know, if you like, you know, this group has a community of practice associated with it, which is kind of built up over many years, and there's an ideology around that of, you know, an ideology, I guess, of, you know, equality among peers kind of thing. For example, that you know, it doesn't matter who you are, that you have equal rights to, you know, everybody has equal rights to speak and join in. So that, you know, it's part of the ideology of the practice in some senses. That it doesn't matter if somebody's a professor or a student. It's and where
does that come from? Does that come from a wider cultural ideology?
Oh yeah, true.
You know, ideologies inside ideologies.
Yeah. Well, yeah, these things are stacked. It's just kind of Russian dolls, isn't it? Or inherited characteristics.
Yeah, and again, sometimes these are explicit and explicit, and other times we don't even know they're there, kind of thing, but we're still operating under them.
Yeah. So I can't remember what it was now, but there was something that somebody else, another member of staff, had done that kind of mildly offended me, right? Because I thought they should have done something, and apparently I was supposed to have done it. And I just, and I remember the head of department just saying, "Oh, well, you obviously thought that doing this thing was part of that role." And I said, "Well, yeah, obviously."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It was obvious to you.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, oh, okay. So it's just, so you suddenly realize that actually your expectations, I mean, that was back, you know, how tasks were divided up and who's you know, module versus module contributors, kind of, you know, it's just like how those things divide.
It's like when you can't understand sort of, well, I find, you know, when I can't understand why someone has a certain or behaves in a certain way. So I'm thinking recently of a union meeting that we were at where we were discussing, well, not really discussing, but anyway, that it came up, the police and crime and sentencing bill that's probably just been passed. which is very, very authoritarian and oppressive. And in my view, in my ideology, my political ideology, extremely dangerous, very undesirable. It's fascist,
very open to abuse.
All those kinds of things. We had a vote on it in the union meeting, and there was one person who voted against it. And I saw that. I have no idea who it was, obviously you can't. I saw that and I just thought, who would vote against it? But then I had to tell myself, oh yeah, not everybody thinks like you. You know, not everybody has that ideology. You know?
Even if they're in a union meeting.
Even if they're in a union meeting. Yeah.
It's not just the general public. No,
you expect it more from the general public, but in a union, I think that's what it was. It was like, who on earth would vote against it? And it's, oh yeah, even in our union, there are people who don't think like me.
It's the ideology thing made me think of something. Do we take it that the notion of norm includes, has a, which is it, deontic or Ptolemaic element? You know, that a norm includes ought or should, doesn't it?
Ptolemaic is desire.
Oh, okay, it's deontic then, yeah? In other words, there is, it's not just a statistical perception, you know, it's a question of rightness, yeah? So it's different from normal or statistically normal. And there's a crossover, there could be a crossover, because what if your ideology, your norms say that you ought to abide by the normal? If you understand what I mean. So that there can be sort of crossovers, can't there? Yeah.
Well, I mean, Grice contrasts empiricism and rationalism in relation to the cooperative principle. So he says, okay, you can just say this is what people do,
right?
You know, that they say indirect things and expect you to work it out. That's what happens. Or you can say that, or his preferred was a rationality thing. It's something we should do because it makes sense to do it. To make that assumption that people are making sense. So it's something we should do and should not abandon. So that's a kind of, sort of the deontic element. So you can look at what happens you can say, oh, it just happens, or that this is what should be. And that, well, I mean, that comes down to rightness, you know, so that the kind of the use of Habermas here, isn't it? But also the Cadar and Hawes, with the moral order kind of thing, because morality always has that sort of evaluation of rightness, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I was wondering whether that's the major difference between the concept of frame and a norm, because I always use the frame in my own analysis when I analyze intercultural misunderstandings. A frame as defined by Tannen and Gumpert in interactional sociolinguistics. But then I realized she focuses on more judgment and evaluation. So maybe that's why she used norm rather than frame.
I see. Yes. Yeah, I must say, in my mind, frame is an amoral thing, if you like. It's a matter of perception.
Well, I mean, I think it really goes back to, I mean, I can't say this categorically because I haven't looked at Tannen's stuff on this, but I imagine it goes back to the AI stuff, artificial intelligence stuff, Shank and Abelson, which is kind of basically, where frame was essentially like genre, actually, a frame for doing an activity. So it was a description of how people did things. Absolutely, that it's not supposed to be any kind of evaluative judgment in any way. It's just, this is how people do this particular kind of task.
But why would you assume that there is no moral element in that? I mean, by I mean, that was really just in kind of stages that people went through, and it would be optional stages or, different routes through, but it was just a descriptive tree of things, or what moves came before other moves kind of thing. Like, for example, if you go into a shop, how do you buy something? And of course, they would be culturally specific. But there was no sort of idea.
I mean, certainly that there will be shoulds and deontic things inside the frame. Yeah. But the way I see it, the perception of what is going on here, is
So the
itself
naming
just a
of
matter of
the
perception.
naming of
Then
the
of
frame,
course,
or
if you
recognizing
decide
the frame.
if you decide X is going on here, then it may well be that it follows from that certain norms of yours will apply.
Yeah,
I'm thinking more, I mean, I think, yeah, indeed, there are different definitions of frame, and some frames are more kind of transactional than others. I think in terms of intercultural research, for example, they're not that kind of frame, they're kind of normative frames. But I think I object to that, to the more kind of amoral definition, because I think that just to decide what is the frame you're looking at, you have already made a moral judgment of some sort, and that applies especially in intercultural communication, but not only. As Jerry said at the beginning, I mean, it's just a matter of scale, right? Whether you're talking about different languages or different dialects or different whatever. So I think that you can't escape the subjectivity of the defining what it is that's going on. And,
oh no, definitely not.
And the participants and their entitlements. So I think only in a very, I can't remember actually who was that did that study of verbs in terms of frames. Fillmore, anyway, there's one framework whereby frames are defined only as you know, kind of objective scenes where people do things, and you just get the schematic. But all the other definitions, I think, imply some sort of normative assessment, and to me, the very decision of what frame you're in is morally loaded, and that's unavoidable.
Yeah.
I think you can also express resistance and opposition within a frame. I mean, I think in my case, in Mexico, most people are expected to be called doctor by the students. So you're meant to be. I don't go for that, and I say to students, you can call me anything you want to, as long as it's respectful. Now, I'm breaking the frame from a normative point of view as well. A lot of my colleagues don't like what I do because it goes against them, because they want their doctor status reinforced. But as a frame in the classroom, I'm quite happy that they call me whatever they like. So I would argue, you know, I agree with Barbara. I think there is a subjective dimension to frames, that you can resist them, oppose them, etc.
Yes, so you are effectively redefining the frame, right? So if people come to you and call you doctor, you say, okay, that's not the frame I work in. My frame says you can call me Jerry. And so you're I mean,
but now I'm not seeing the difference between a frame and a norm in that discussion.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah,
that's where the problem comes.
But I mean, I think really it's just a matter of definition. So if you think of a frame as a scene and a norm as a statement of something that goes on within the scene, I don't think there's any overlap. But and I think people have defined them in different ways. But there will be norms that define what can go on in a certain frame. That's, I mean, I think of frames as scenes of some sort.
Yeah, another issue in intercultural communication with frame is when people behave according to a different frame, we usually don't assume that. We usually interpret other people's behavior according to our own frames.
Yeah.
Therefore, we feel offended because that we just interpret that as attitude, negative attitude, or
well,
implied.
like in the example in the article of there was it somebody, a student asking somebody for, or going for a job interview or something like that, and I don't think it was a job in, but giving them a letter of recommendation, and they had one. They thought they were in one frame, and the other person didn't. So they were operating in different frames. So they had different norms, and the student got offended.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think actually in that particular example that the the secretary was, I suppose we probably all mostly see secretaries as gatekeepers to the whoever's behind the secretary kind of thing. And that if the letter of recommendation had been a different kind of letter of recommendation, maybe it would have led to a job interview. So probably the protagonist's perception of what was going to happen was not unreasonable, but it was because actually they were being double-crossed that it wasn't in fact the case.
Yeah, it's very, very particular. That
very complex.
Yeah.
So it was, I just looked it up and checked it. It was Fillmore that studied frames, and the verbs that I was referring to were sell and buy. So he says, well, you can't understand the word sell without knowing anything about the situation of commercial transfer, which also involves, among other things, a seller, a buyer, goods, money, the relation between the money and the goods, the relation between the seller and the money, the relation between the buyer and the goods and the money, and so on. So a word activates a frame of semantic knowledge relating to the specific concept to which it refers.
Well, that's, to me, I mean, okay, it is just terminology. To me, that's what you would call schema instead of or script. Yeah.
But it's an example of frame understood in a more transactional sense than the moral normative.
I think thinking what Karen was doing, what's the difference between norms and frames? I don't know whether frames is more to do with positioning and norms is more to do with behavior. And that's where they both overlap. That we take a typical frame is what is the positioning of people, what do they do? Whilst norms could be more their behavior, whether it's social, group, discourse, communities. I don't know if that sort of, because it's difficult, isn't it? The difference between norms and frames.
I guess provided we, well, it's always the same thing, isn't it? Provided we know what we're talking about at any one time and try to make it clear. In the end, it doesn't matter so much which terms we use. Personally, I associate frame with activity type very much.
Exactly. Yes, Levinson.
Whereas norm relates to specific acts, really. Doesn't it? Norms, that's or what in Levinson in terms of activity act would call allowable contributions.
Yeah. I think that's useful. Do you think?
We've been going for more than an hour. Who'd have thought it?
It's a really good paper, I think.
Yes, I thought it was a good choice. Thank you.
Well, that was, well, I have to confess I was personally interested in the topic, but it did turn out to be very useful as well.
It's nice to have something. Something to get your teeth into, which is quite nice.
Yeah, I have to say, I can't resist saying, but this is inevitable, of course. You can't do everything in one book, never mind one article.
Yeah, well, I know.
But I thought it was funny, that his very first example, which is on page 142, when he's further illustrating Habermas's validity claims and so on. It's page 142 to 143, and then he analyzes it, in terms of validity claims. And I thought, well, hang on, the thing that stands out here is the same thing that is the same thing that happened to you, Pingdu. Somebody says something and the other person just ignores them and doesn't speak back to them. That's the really glaring thing. He says, "Good evening, brothers," and they don't say anything back, not to him. You see what I mean?
Is your brother here? Is somebody's brother here? Yeah.
Yeah, and how rude. Anyway, I just, I thought that was, it's always like that, isn't it? You can't do everything. I quite like the analysis there.
Yeah.
We'll read Habermas now.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and it's the list of many things I intend to read at some point.
Yes, I hear you, Bethan. My list is endless.
Yeah.
Oh, Right, I'm going to stop recording if I can find the button. Do we want a break for a cup of tea before we carry on with business and let those people?
I can only be here till 4, just so you know.
Oh, right. Okay. So should we not bother with a break then?
I wouldn't mind going to get a coffee, I must admit, if other people don't mind.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, it depends what business